In 1647, a Portuguese military governor sat down to write a letter to his king. He had cannons, he had muskets, he had the backing of the most aggressive colonial empire on earth. And yet the words he wrote were not words of conquest, they were words of defeat. The letter described a woman who had held Portugal at bay for over 3 decades, 30 years, across 7 separate military campaigns. A woman who had built alliances that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Central African plateau. A woman who had turned the geography of her own land into a weapon. Her name was Njinga Mbande, Queen of Ndongo and Matamba, Supreme Commander of the Imbangala Warrior Confederacy. And the suppressed truth of her military genius, her diplomatic architecture, her psychological warfare, her sovereign intelligence, is the receipt we are opening today. To understand Njinga, you must first understand the mathematics of the world she was born into. By the early 1600s, Portugal had established Luanda as the primary industrial node of the transatlantic slave trade. The numbers are not abstractions. 10,000 to 15,000 Mbundu people were being exported annually through that single port. The Portuguese needed the interior, and the interior was Njinga's inheritance. When her brother, King Angola Mbande, sent her to negotiate with Portuguese Governor João Correia de Sousa in 1622, she did not arrive as a supplicant. She arrived as a sovereign strategist. The famous scene, where the Portuguese offered her no chair, intending humiliation, and she commanded one of her attendants to kneel on all fours, using that person as her throne. This was not improvisation. This was a calculated, documented act of psychological dominance, recorded by the Capuchin missionary Giovanni Cavazzi de Montecuccolo, whose accounts, when cross-referenced with Mbundu oral tradition compiled by Angolan historian Beatrix Heinze, confirm the episode's authenticity and its intended political meaning. She walked out of that meeting having secured a temporary ceasefire, and having demonstrated to every indigenous observer present that the colonizers' theater of dominance could be redirected, reversed, and reclaimed. The logic of Njinga was always geometric. She understood power as a terrain to be mapped and navigated, not a hierarchy to be submitted to. After assuming full power, following her brother's suspicious death in 1624, Njinga did not simply inherit a kingdom. She engineered one. When Portuguese pressure forced her eastward, she did not retreat. She relocated her sovereignty. Matamba, the kingdom she conquered and transformed, became what we must accurately call an intellectual and military fortress. She reorganized the Imbangala, historically feared stateless warriors, into a disciplined standing army operating under her command structure. Angolan scholars, including Virgilio Silho, and the foundational documentary research emerging from the Arquivo Histórico Nacional de Angola, confirm that Njinga restructured Imbangala military doctrine, integrating their tactical fluidity with centralized Ndongo governance principles. She controlled the roads. This is not metaphor, it is military geography. The Portuguese slave trade required overland routes into the interior. Njinga's forces systematically denied, disrupted, and taxed those routes. She built a network of allied chieftains, a diplomatic web that functioned as both an intelligence system and a military alliance framework. When Portuguese forces advanced, they found roads empty, wells dry, and populations vanished. When they retreated, they found themselves flanked. This was not only war. The daily reality of Matamba under Njinga was a functioning civilizational project. Trade networks with interior kingdoms, agricultural surplus that could sustain a mobile military population, a court that conducted diplomacy simultaneously in Kimbundu, Portuguese, and through Imbangala ceremonial registers. We built complexity. We always did. And then they rewrote her. The European archive did not simply ignore Njinga Mbande. They could not, she was too significant, too documented even in their own records, so they did what they have always done. They distorted, they pathologized, they sexualized, they converted her military genius into savagery, her political strategy into witchcraft, her sovereignty into aberration. 19th century colonial historians, the very sources too many Western textbooks still treat as primary authority, described her through the lens of racial hierarchy and gender pathology. They wrote of her cannibalism. They wrote of her cruelty. They wrote of her instability. What they could not bring themselves to write clearly, honestly, without qualification was this: she defeated them. The suppressed truth of the colonial archive is that its silences are architectural. They are not accidents. The absence of Njinga from global historical consciousness, from the same syllabi that celebrate Alexander of Macedon, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Sun Tzu, is not an oversight. It is a policy, and we now have the tools to dismantle it. The scholarship of Selma Pantoja, the University of Brasilia historian whose decades of Lusophone African archival recovery have reconstructed Njinga's biography from indigenous and Portuguese sources simultaneously, provides what the colonial narrative cannot: a woman fully rendered in her own context, on her own terms, by a scholar who understands both the language and the stakes. We do not reclaim Njinga Mbande to make her comfortable for modern consumption. We do not flatten her into a poster. She was complex. She made alliances that cost people. She operated in a world of impossible choices, surrounded by empire on every side. That complexity is the point. It is the evidence of a full human being, navigating a full political reality, not a myth, not a symbol, but a documented, sovereign, intellectual force. The receipt is this: Portugal, with its cannons, its papal backing, its Atlantic empire, its slave trade infrastructure, and its professional military, could not conquer the Matamba Plateau for over 30 years. Not because of terrain alone, not because of luck, but because one woman understood power, geography, psychology, diplomacy, and warfare with a precision that her enemies, for all their resources, could not match. They built archives to contain her. We are building archives to restore her. The Ancestor's receipt is not a mythology project. It is a reparative cartography, mapping what was deliberately unmapped, naming what was deliberately unnamed, and returning to the historical record what was deliberately removed from it. Njinga Mbande. Queen, general, architect of sovereignty. The woman Portugal could not defeat. We remember. We document. We do not forget. The Ancestor's receipt. Subscribe the sources listed in full in video description.